welcome then Geoff Henderson to talk about Gareth Jones, son of Barry, hero of Ukraine. Welcome, Mr. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Gareth Jones is one of only 3 people that the Ukraine government recognise, 3 Brits, that the Ukraine government recognise as significant in the history of Ukraine. And 2 of them are Welsh. The other Welshman is John Hughes, who founded the steel industry in Donetsk. And the 3rd Brit is Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a writer for the Manchester Guardian at the time, the period that I'm going to be talking about. Gareth himself came from a very academic, intellectually minded family. He was born in 1905. His father, Major Edgar Jones, was a pillar of the academic community, was a member of the Council of Aberystwyth University, headmaster of a school in Barry and in Llandilo, but was a much bigger character than just the headmaster of a school at the time. He met his wife Annie at university, and this is Annie. And in this photograph, she's in Ukraine, and she's the nanny to the grandchildren of the aforesaid John Hughes. So she was there for 3 years, and her experience there and her stories of it inspired a desire to travel on the part of her son. And he's 6 years old with his mother and his father in these sets of photographs. His mother was equally important. She held the first suffragette meeting in Wales. And she was very active in all sorts of fields. And at one point, she took 90 women on a trip to Paris and Berlin. Virtually unheard of at the time. So they were quite remarkable parents, really. This is where he was born, and hence that's where the blue plaque is. And he's described as a pioneering investigative journalist, which indeed was what he became. He studied well. He was fluent in 5 languages, if you include English. And he was described by a number of his tutors as the most gifted linguist of his time. He just had a natural affinity for it. He traveled widely. He traveled to Germany every year from 1923 onwards. He was fascinated by the German language and the German people. He was fluent in French, but he didn't much like the French. Nothing's changed with some people, really. He was very widely traveled. He was very informed. He was intellectually curious about things. He was gregarious. He had a nice sense of humor. He was exuberant, and he was certainly erudite. We'd all like him, I think. Very easy man to like. And he came top at Cambridge. He seems to come top at just about everything that he did. And to improve his Russian, he signed up on a tramp steamer sailing out of Barry, which was headed for Stockholm. And his plan was to go on to Latvia to brush up his Russian and stay with a Russian-speaking family. At one point during this stay, he was hoping also to be able to teach English. He never managed to do very much of that. But at one supper with the family he was staying with, he was asked to say grace. So he spoke a mix of the Lord's Prayer, Men of Harlech, and the Welsh national anthem, and did it in Welsh, and hoped that no one understood. This is his final year at Cambridge. He was a member of the League of Nations Union, and he does look, he's serious about things that you need to be serious about, I think is the best way to think of him. And I'm not quite sure about this lady. She looks distinctly unhappy. And here he is in a photograph. But he generally, you see him as a serious-looking character. After he finished university, he wanted to become a journalist. His parents wanted him to become a teacher, but no, he wanted to be a journalist. He did succeed in getting a 1-month trial at the Times, and at the end of which they said, bugger off, go and get some experience with a provincial newspaper and come back when you know something about the business. He did get an article published in the Times, about eighth year of fascism in Italy. But unless you were a well-known journalist at the time, you didn't get your name on the article. It would either be from our correspondent or there'd be nothing at all. It'd just be an article. So off he goes. But before he gets a chance to do any journalism, a friend of his father's, Thomas Jones, who was cabinet secretary in the Lloyd George government and a fantastically well-connected character, was an old friend of his father, and he introduced him to Lloyd George, who was looking for a foreign affairs advisor. This is the huge golden key to Gareth's career. It's 7 years since Lloyd George was Prime Minister, but he's still a power and a force in the land. And he's very interventionist. He makes speeches, he's writing articles and whatever. And he's looking for someone to read the foreign press, particularly he was worried about what was going on in Germany. He was interested in what was going on in Russia. He wanted someone who could read that and appreciate for him and give him material for his talks. And he was prepared to pay him £500 a year for it. That's equivalent of about £45,000 a year today. Now, I know some law graduates are coming out of university today with massively substantial salaries, but he was probably the best paid graduate of his year by some margin when he took on this job. And one of the things he learned and developed was he had a really good eye for detail and explaining things to people. And not only was he good at observing what was going on and explaining it clearly, he would explain why it was relevant or why it was significant. And that gave him something of an edge. And that suited Lloyd George in particular. One of the first things he did for Lloyd George was go after the Pontine marshes in Italy. There was some sort of experiments going on in that part of Italy, which was fascist by that point. And he said, well, off you go, Italy, go there, have a look, come back, tell me what's going on, and I'll decide whether I want to do something about it or not. So he starts to travel, which is what he loves doing. And the following year, Lloyd George says, okay, off to Russia, tell me what's happening in the place. At this point, Lloyd George is a fan of Stalin because he's believing the propaganda that's coming out of the Soviet Union. And he asks him to observe and report on the conditions of living. And this is the sort of propaganda that's being pushed out in the West about bounteous harvests and everybody's happy and all the rest of it. He goes to the embassy, the Russian embassy, to get a visa, and he's welcomed because he's got a letter of introduction from Lloyd George. And he wants to go to Hughesovska, which is where his mother was nanny to John Hughes' grandchildren. He's been inspired by this, so he has to go. He's only able to spend a day, and he doesn't get to visit the Hughes household, but he does get to visit. And Malcolm Muggeridge is already writing articles about the situation in Russia and saying it's not all it appears to be. Things are not well in Russia. And Gareth Jones comes back and gets an article published in the Times, again without his byline, but he describes it as there are two Russias. There's one which is laden with champagne and caviar, and there's the other one where people are starving. And he sends this postcard to his parents on his way back from this trip. And it's a very carefully written card because it has to go through the censor. So he doesn't let on at all to what he's going to write about when he gets home. And he does a talk for the BBC. And he's very grumpy about it because they only paid him 32 guineas. So he had a keen sense of value. And one of the things he comes back with is that the 20th century is going to be a battle between capitalism and communism. That's the scrap that we're all facing. He contributes, he's been trying to persuade his parents to buy a house because they're renting the house in Romilly Road. And he persuades his parents to buy this house for £1,250. And he contributes £400 of it. And because he's in America and got some connections with the Heinz family send boxes of baked beans to to the family. They must think they're starving or something. And these are photographs of his parents taken much, much later in life. And Gareth's mother wore black for the rest of her life after his death. And he makes another visit to Russia for Ivy Lee. Now, Lloyd George, just some months before this, Lloyd George had to cut back on his living expenses. So Gareth was effectively made redundant, along with a number of other members of Lloyd George's staff. But he wasn't unoccupied for long, because Bernard Paris, who's a very mysterious character, had sort of tried to recruit Gareth as a member of the Secret Service. And he's one of these spooky characters in the background. And he's an expert on Russia. He's consulted by all sorts of people, and he's got connections all over the place. And he recommends Gareth to Ivy Lee. Now, Ivy Lee, this rather stern-looking gentleman, he's the epitome of public relations. He effectively invented public relations in America. He understood it perfectly, and all the large corporations in America were his customers: Rockefeller, General Motors, Heinz, all sorts of. If you were a big company and you wanted your message, your advertising to work, Ivy Lee was the man to talk to. And Ivy Lee wanted to satisfy one of his customers, Jack Heinz, and Jack Heinz wanted his son to visit Russia. So who better to do this than a fluent Russian speaker? Especially a man, pardon me, with a letter of introduction from Lloyd George, which he used to good effect, even doctoring it after it had expired. So he goes off to Russia, and he's paid £800 a year. So that's the equivalent of almost £100,000 a year at this point. To take Jack Heinz, to work for Ivy Lee, but in particular to take Jack Heinz to Russia. So off they go, and they meet Karl Radek, who's the editor of Izvestia, and who falls out with Stalin somewhat later on, and goes sent to a labor camp and is eventually executed. I know you can say that for about 3 million people in Russia, probably. But he was one of the top men at the time of the revolution. And they travel around Russia. And they meet Cecil B. DeMille. He's in Russia on something or other. And they also met Lenin's widow, Krupskaya. Now, she had fallen out with Stalin to the point where Stalin said, if you say anything again publicly that's critical of the regime, I will appoint Lenin another widow. And no doubt meant it. So she towed the party line after that. And when she met Jones, she said, look, the only thing I'm going to talk about is our education system. Nothing else, nothing controversial. And they traveled around. They saw the grand hydroelectric projects and lines of cheerful women and plenty of food and all the rest of it. And they publish a document when they come back called Experiences in Russia, a diary published anonymously, but it's clearly most of it's written by Jones. When he gets back to America, it's, of course, this is the time of the Depression, and Hoover is the president, and he goes to Washington, and he goes to visit the White House, as one does, and there's a party of Americans being shown around doing a tour of the White House. And traditionally, apparently, when people do these tours, if the president's in, he appears in the photograph. So Jones just joined the back of the group, and there he is. And it's interesting when you put together a talk, something. I'm very skeptical of what I read. And there's an extremely good book, a single volume, I'll show you a bit later on, which is an introduction by a Welshman who says in the introduction that Jones met Roosevelt. Now, he definitely was in close to Hoover, but he didn't get to talk to him. He did talk to Al Smith, who was the guy that Hoover had beaten in the previous presidential election. But the assertion is made in this particular book that he met Roosevelt. And I've read everything published about Jones. And I've no recollection of that. He does talk about Roosevelt when he's doing his trip later on. So I emailed the guy who wrote the introduction to the book, and I said, "What's your source for this?" And I'm sad to say that I've not had a reply. And I sent it 2 years ago, I think. But it is interesting that how the way the word spreads around about people. But he does describe the slum villages and towns around America were christened Hoovervilles, which is a real pointed remark at the president. And this one's in Central Park. And they're all over America. They've got 30-odd million unemployed, desperate situation. He does write about Roosevelt, and he says he's a weak, wishy-washy man and will make a rotten president. And I can't agree with that remark, but he describes him as a will-o'-the-wisp. And certainly people who knew Roosevelt well came out saying, well, the thing about he plays his cards so close to his chest that his left hand doesn't know what his right hand is doing. But he was a very clever man, I think. The right man at the right time. He finishes his stint in America, comes back with a shining reference from Ivy Lee, and goes back to work for Lloyd George to help him write his war memoirs. But he's got a bee in his bonnet about what he's seen in Russia, and Russia continues to pump out this publicity about how wonderful it all is. And he does a nationwide tour, a speaking tour, Gareth Jones, and he's really got a bee in his bonnet about this. And the talk is either will there be soup or will there be bread? You know, the situation is dire, and he's keen to return to Russia. So in January, he decides he's going to do a trip. He's funding it himself. He's not employed by this. He's freelancing as a journalist. He's clearly got commissions from the Western Mail, and other people will buy his articles, but he's taking the risk. He's funding this himself. And this was the map in the Western Mail. So he's naturally enough going to start in Bari, and he's going to work his way across Moscow, going into the Ukraine. Oh, here's Moscow, sorry. And popping about. For which he needs a visa, and he goes to the Soviet embassy in London, where Ivan Maysky is the ambassador. And he's treated to caviar, and he's treated very well because he's still seen as having a connection with Lloyd George. And that swings a lot. And Lloyd George is a fan of Stalin, publicly a fan of what Stalin is doing. In the meantime, since his first visit, Stalin has closed the borders to Ukraine. So he's got a visa for Russia, but he's not allowed to go to Ukraine. And unsurprisingly, I've read Maysky's diaries. There's no mention of Gareth Jones in his diaries for really good reason. He'd be afraid to mention it after the trouble that Gareth is about to cause him. His first stop is Germany. And guess what? There are only 2 British journalists on Hitler's first flight to one of his major rallies, and one of them is Gareth Jones, who's a freelance. The other journalist is Sefton Delmer, who was lead journalist for the Western Mail, for the Daily Express, which I looked it up earlier today. The Daily Express was the best-selling newspaper in the world at one point in the 20s and 30s. Anyway, Sefton Delmer, you can see why Sefton Delmer's on it, because he'd interviewed Hitler in 1931. And it's a little bit of a puzzle. Well, how come Jones was the second one? And the chap who was head of the Foreign Press Bureau for the German regime was a man called Fritzi Heifstangl, some curious name. He was a pianist. And he used to entertain Hitler. Hitler liked him because he could play the piano, and he was an entertaining sort of character. And he put him in charge of the foreign press because his languages were good. And he'd met Jones earlier and clearly had some respect for him. So that's the speculation on how Jones is the second man on the flight. The pianist himself fell out with Hitler some years later and had to leave Germany in a hurry and ended up being an advisor to Roosevelt. There's an interesting character by himself. Anyway, he gets on the aircraft, Hitler's aircraft, and here he is reading the newspaper. And in his diary he says, if this plane should crash, the whole history of Europe will change. He describes Goebbels as looking just like a Welsh miner. He never forgets his Welshness, it pops up all over the place. And he describes Hitler as looking like a middle-class grocer. But he does say there are two Hitlers. There's the one who's sitting there, and he looks perfectly ordinary and whatever. And then there's the other chap who stands up in front of 100,000 people and drives them into a frenzy. And he does make a comparison at this rally that he goes to, that the German flags they were flying were higher than the flags that were flown at the Eisteddfod. That is very important to him. Anyway, he does his time in Germany and he heads for Russia. Propaganda at the time, equality, the subliminal message to all of this, and a land of plenty. He goes to the opera with the German ambassador, and he writes to Lloyd George, I'm astonished at your admiration for Stalin. Just doesn't make any sense to me. This is a land, he says, of lipstick and caviar and people starving to death. Then he gets on the train and goes south. And now the Ukraine is closed. Not the Ukraine. Ukraine is closed to outsiders. So he heads south from Moscow on a train with a minder. And the minder is busy telling him how wonderful everything is in Russia. And these are some of the photographs of what's going on in Ukraine at the time. People dying in the street. People walking past him, last thing you want to do. This is a spittoon. And there's a spittoon in every railway carriage. And he's sitting there with this communist who's telling him how wonderful everything is in Russia. And he breaks a crust. Gareth Jones breaks a crust off a piece of bread, throws it in the spittoon, and a child dashes in, pulls it out, and eats it. And he looks at the communist, and he doesn't say anything. And then he does the same with a piece of orange peel, throws it in, same thing. It's not there a second. And he just looks at the communist and goes. And then he does something super smart. He gets off the train a couple of stations before the final destination in Russia, walks out of the railway station and walks across the border into Ukraine. And comes back with some phenomenal headlines. These headlines go all over the world. He exposes it as a man-made famine. Right? The word genocide wasn't invented till 1944. This is the first time man-made famine is used to describe what's going on. And it gets huge coverage in the West. Massively embarrasses the Soviet government, massively embarrasses Stalin, and quite embarrasses the British government. Stalin at the time is trying to negotiate entry to the League of Nations. This is not going to help. And he estimates 3.5 to 5 million people died. This notice in Russian says it's strictly forbidden to bury people here. Can you imagine? And one of his headlines is, they're killing us. And it's clearly deliberate killing of Ukrainians. Well, what the consequence of that is that the Soviet Union marshal their resources and attack Jones reporting. Now, the most highly paid journalist in the world at this point is this chap, Walter Duranty, who writes for the New York Times, Pulitzer Prize winner. This is H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, Henriot, who's an ex-Prime Minister of France. These guys are in Russia, being shown around, being shown what the Soviet government want them to see, getting this very favorable picture of everything. And these guys go on the attack. And you get quotes like this, like a garden, Russia is like a garden in full bloom. Somebody describes Stalin as a giant. a gentleman, and all they saw was the happy faces of healthy people. Now, it's important to understand that every foreign journalist who's in Russia at this point is only there because Russia is in receipt of huge amounts of money from the West. And a condition of the grants to Russia are that we can put journalists in Russia to report what's going on. They get their Durante is living like a king, has a huge apartment adjacent to the Kremlin, a driver, maidservants, whatever. They're treated like royalty. They're taken anywhere the Soviet government wants to take them, but they almost never step outside Moscow. But it's a very, very powerful attack. That this is the top man in the reporting world. And the consequence of that is that Jones is banned from ever entering Russia or Russian territory again, and he's completely discredited in the Western press. And they publish things like, well, of course, he's a young man, he hasn't got the experience that we've got. You can imagine it, can't you? Anything to discredit him. He's left with very, very few supporters, many of whom afterwards describe it as the shabbiest period of their lives that they took part in this attack. And Lloyd George believed it. And Lloyd George and Jones never spoke again. So he falls back on a job with the Western Mail and makes the most of it. He travels all over Wales, travels to Ireland, meets Eamon de Valera, meets John Buchan. He writes some lovely articles on a series called Craftsmen of Wales. And because he's such a good observer and he writes so well and he's a good listener, that they're really, really interesting articles. A lot of them, you can find them on the internet. And he travels around the country giving talks on the enigma of Bolshevik Russia. He can't get Russia out of his head, really. And he visits Germany again the following year, under his own steam, not as a paid correspondent, but hoping to sell his articles when he comes back. And he talks about Germany as having 10,000 planes. And he's very prescient about the Second World War. He covers the murder of Rome, who was the head of the SA who Hitler had killed because he was an alternative source of power. He talks about Dolphus. He also found time when he was back to talk to the Rotary Club of Cardiff. I don't think he ever came to Porthcawl Rotary Club, though. And he wrote a lovely article on the origins of the National Eisteddfod, the Western Mail. And his article, the fact that he was around and writing articles, gets a mention in the Berliner Tagblatt. And that's got a connection a bit later on. In June 1934, he meets William Randolph Hearst, who's living at St. Donat's. And during their conversation, Hearst says, of course, the British are welshing on their debts to repay the money that was borrowed by the UK from America to finance the First World War. And Jones says, hang on a minute, welshing? What do you mean by welshing? And Hearst says, well, this was a phrase devised by Englishmen to gratify the vanities and prejudices of Englishmen. So, fair enough then. And Hearst is very keen to meet Hitler. He's one of the preeminent newspaper men in the world. And he wants to travel and who better but a man who's fluent in German, go off and meet Hitler, and offers him a large amount of money to do this. And Jones says, no thanks, it clashes with the Eisteddfod. But Hearst does sign him up to do a tour, a radio talks and a tour in North America, and to visit him in San Simeon, which was his castle in California. So Gareth decides on the back of that, I shall go and see a part of the world I don't know anything about. I'll travel to Asia. I'll go from Barrie, fly to the US, go to San Francisco, New York, San Francisco, Hawaii, by ship to Japan, and then around. So this is his plan, places he's never been before. He signs up as a sort of freelance for a number of newspapers who will buy his articles that he will publish as he's going along. And on his way across America, he goes and meets Frank Lloyd Wright, who had Welsh antecedents, has the Druidic symbol on the doorframe all the door frames in his house. And he also, when he gets to Hollywood, he writes to his parents and says, you can see he's starstruck at some point. He says, I've just had lunch in a dining room at Hollywood, in the same dining room as the Marx Brothers. So he never loses touch, I don't think. And he writes some fantastic stuff about America. Now, America is it's a federated state, federated nation, and the issue of states' rights is very, very important, and they guard them jealously. There are things that the federal government is allowed to do, but not easily. Each state has got a Secretary of State. They have no foreign affairs of their own. They've got a Secretary of State, a Secretary of the Treasury, and so on. And they operate as independently as they possibly can. The thing that unites them is the dollar. But apart from that, it's important that we are different to that state, and they're different to us, and we have our own laws. The debate that's going on about abortion law in America today is a classic. Different states have got different attitudes and will approach it in different ways. And he starts to write about it being a United States. And he's one of the first people to start writing about this intelligently. And what has united the states is technologies. Cars. People can travel around better. Trains, aircraft, radio, telephones. The FBI even. That's the first time there's any federal organization. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was a federal initiative by Roosevelt to bring water and electricity to the Tennessee Valley, which touched a number of states and was a huge success. And about the only water project in America ever that stayed in federal government hands, because all power generation and water is all privatized. And it's never all private, it's never been anything else. So he's talking very intelligently about this is the United States, and what's binding the states together is technology. There's a radio talk in Los Angeles about what he saw in Russia. And this is a remark. The next war is you'll hear the burr of aircraft propellers. That's the first sound that you will hear in the next war. So true for Poland in 1939. And he writes some articles for Hearst that Hearst publishes in his journal. This is San Simeon, his modest castle in California. And Hearst is very anti-Russian at this point, so he's encouraging Jones to write this stuff, and he's encouraging other writers to send him anti-Russian material so that he can knock the Soviet Union. And Jones talks about the official murders and what becomes known as the Stalin purges of 1937, 1938, 1939. So he gets really wide coverage for that. Then he gets on a boat to head for Hawaii. And while he's at sea, the Hearst press published some really heavy articles about the situation in Ukraine. They're really quite hyper, talked up, serious stuff, but he's really making the most of it. Anything that punishes Stalin is his view. And this gets very wide coverage in America. And what happens 24 hours later is that it's exposed as a fraud. And the guy who's written the articles has never been to Russia, but he's been briefed by the Soviet embassy, and he's written this scandalous stuff that can be easily disproved, which it is. And the consequence of that is Jones is discredited once again. And that's it, not published anymore. And he's out in the cold, but he doesn't know it because he's on a ship to Hawaii. While he's in Hawaii, he buys some sheet music from Morvith, who was an old friend of his in Barrie. And then he gets to Tokyo. And these are 3 of the 6 men who started the Japanese war in the Pacific. And he interviews all 6. I mean, he's got fantastic access to people. He's still flashing a letter that's got Lloyd George's name in it, that he's Tipp-Exed and changed in some way, but it's good enough. And he writes very, very well about what's going on. But he goes to a geisha house. This lady is an apprentice geisha, and he's clearly enjoying himself. But in one of his letters or one of his articles, he writes, there's a dance hall in Barry called Bindles. Right. Oh, some of you have been there. I knew you'd have been there. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And he says, well, these places are 3 times the price of Bindles. So it does never lose touch, but he does. In his writing back, he says that Japan is intent on owning the Philippines, China, Malaya, and Borneo. And boy, was that right. This is 1935. And then he leaves Japan and heads off to Thailand. Some photographs of him. And when in his writings, he says, Asia is heading towards socialism, just like Hitler, just like Mussolini, and just like Roosevelt. He still sees Roosevelt as a socialist, a very left socialist. And then in July, he decides he wants to go to Mongolia. Now, Japan has invaded North China and is in the process of setting up Manchukuo as a separate entity. Have you seen the film The Last Emperor? It's about this is where it is set. And he wants to know what's going on. And of course, he's funding himself still at this point. And he gets to Japan and he meets Mr. Stein, who's a correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor and the Berliner Tagblatt. So they've got a media connection, who's got an apartment in Japan and says, well, I can put you up. Maybe you want somewhere to stay? Ideal, come and stay with me. So he does. Through Stein, he meets a guy called Purpose, who's also Russian, who's got the equivalent of a car hire company or a van hire company, well connected in all sorts of ways. And says, well, if you want to go to Mongolia, you need a vehicle and you're going to need a driver. And Mr. Purpose can provide the vehicle. And Purpose says, oh yeah, I'll come with you. So he's quite encouraged at this point. And the Purpose introduces him to Mr. Muller as the guide, who's a journalist, but a fluent Mandarin speaker. So this is ideal. And he was also a press correspondent. So this is all slotting very nicely into place. And Mr. Purpose will provide a driver. So off they go. And in Mongolia, he tastes the bread and butter, and in one of his articles he says, it's just like the bread and butter you get in Brecon and Carmarthen. You know? And this gentleman, this hat signifies he's the direct descendant of Kubla Khan. The only people allowed to wear hats like that. He meets all sorts of people. This is the truck that they've got. Spends a lot of time being stuck in the mud, and the locals come out and pull it out. And this is his diary entry for the 23rd of July. I'll read a bit of it. Great events. There are 2 roads to where we want to go. 200 Japanese lorries have gone over one, so that's quite safe. The other one's infested by bandits. But I'm told they're very pleasant and they don't attack foreigners. Dr. Muller knows the bandit leader quite well, and we may call in to see him. Gloriously naive, really. And all his notebooks, the images, they're about this sort of size, and there are dozens and dozens of them. But the next we hear is that it's been reported as he's been kidnapped by the bandits. And the question is, are the Japanese funding this? Because Japan is busy extending its territorial acquisitions in northeastern China, and it's thought, and certainly Gareth's niece, Margaret Colley, thought that it was the Japanese were behind this. They were afraid that he would expose what was going on in what the Japanese were doing in China. Or are they paid by Russia? Or are they simply doing it for ransom? Is it just business is business? And then the news comes later that he's been found murdered. Shot 3 times. And there's a report, Muller puts a report in the Berliner Tagblatt and saying how terribly sad all this is. So the question is, who did it? So these are the players. And whenever something like this happens, and it's unusual, I find myself asking the question, well, who benefits from this? You can speculate all day about who might have done it, but who benefits is not a bad way of looking at things. I know. So these are the guys. This is Mr. Stein, Mr. Purpose, Mr. Muller, Anatoly the driver. Stein is described as a man about whom too little is known. There's no photograph of him. But it turns out he's a member of the NKVD, which is the predecessor to the KGB, the Russian Secret Service. And later on in his career, the chap who stays in his apartment with him is Richard Sorge, who was Russia's most successful spy in Japan in the run-up and during the Second World War. So there's a very clear connection there. And Mr. Purpose, guess what? He's also a member of the NKVD, and the company, the Far East Trading Company, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the NKVD. There's an FBI file on him that's about this thick. And his connection later on is with Kim Philby. So these two have got form. Would you agree? Right. Now what about Mr. Muller? Well. MI6 have been tracking him for 34 years. And they've got a file this thick on him. And Anatoly, perhaps he's the innocent in all of this. Well, he's a member of the Soviet military, he's just out of uniform. So he's surrounded by enemies, really. And what happens some days later, and one day apart, Anatoly is released on the 29th, and Muller, who's the Chinese speaker, is released on the 30th. So you can't negotiate with Gareth. He doesn't speak Chinese, doesn't speak Mandarin. And Jones is shot on the 12th of August. And in Lloyd George's words, he was a man who knew too much. So I think you have to conclude that Stalin is behind this killing. The British government thought so. And when papers came back from the British embassy in Beijing and in Tokyo, they suppressed a lot of that and gave a very doctored version of it to Lloyd George, because they thought if they told him everything they knew, he'd cause trouble for the government. So they did a cover-up. There were memorial services for him in China and in Barry, of course. And he was buried on the 2 days before Christmas. He was killed the day before his 30th birthday. And then his parents had to contend with burying his remains 2 days before Christmas. It's unimaginable, really. And then he's forgotten about. And he's forgotten about because it's the mid-1930s, the rise of Germany. The UK is completely preoccupied by all of that, and he's forgotten. For 10 years, until George Orwell writes about Mr. Jones in his book Animal Farm. And there is a connection between the two, but then most people didn't spot the link, and the book was a great success. And off he went, and then he's forgotten again. For 45 years, until 1990, and his niece, Margaret Colley, finds all his notebooks in the attic, because the house, Errol, in Barry, is to be sold, and she's going through the attic. One book says that she found this briefcase with his initials on in the attic. Another one says she found it under the stairs. Doesn't matter, it was found, and it was loaded with these notebooks. So she spent 10 years going through these notebooks and published a book in 2001, which was about the killing, the Manchukuo incident, in which she accused the Japanese of doing it. 2005, she publishes the second book, More Than a Grain of Truth. This plaque is put up in Aberystwyth University in English, Welsh, and Ukrainian. In 2008, he's awarded the Ukrainian Order of Freedom. And then BBC4 publish this program about Stalin and Mr. Jones. It's available on YouTube. That's the place to find it. It's really fascinating. And then the first person outside the family who writes about Gareth Jones is Ray Gamache, who calls it Eyewitness to the Holodomor. Ben McIntyre in the Times picks up the tale in 2014 and starts running a campaign to strip Walter Duranty of the Pulitzer Prize. But the New York Times and the Pulitzer people don't budge. But it's getting a lot of publicity now, and there are events being held, even in comic books featuring him. In 2018, the definitive book about the famine in Ukraine by Anne Applebaum is published. Toughest read you can imagine. And then the film Mr. Jones, which what's correct about it is that he did go to Russia. His name was Gareth Jones, and he did go to Ukraine. And there might be something else, but otherwise it's too Hollywoodized. Really, there's love interest in it, which never took place. And Reagamash publishes his second book about Jones's time in Germany. And then Martin Shipton, who was a correspondent, writer for the Western Mail, published, if you're only going to read one book, that's the one to read, I think. It's very, very good. And events taking place all over the place. And the good thing that came out of the film was the people who were making the film said to the Ukrainian government, I mean, you've made this guy a hero of Ukraine. There isn't even a street named after him. So they do. They name a street, Gareth Jones Street. And there's still a travelling scholarship. Youngsters can apply for funds to go and travel. Excellent website. So you've got a chap he's only 30, and in the 5 years of reporting, he's met some of the most significant people in the world and written about them very, very perceptively. But he never lost sight of his Welshness, and he was determined about what he was going to do. As I said earlier, his parents wanted him to be a teacher. And in one of his letters back just not long after he graduated, this is an excerpt from it. I would consider myself a flabby little coward if I didn't do something good and interesting, just in order to be safe. Courage, determination, curiosity, call it what you want. So who knows if he'd lived longer, what he might have achieved. Probably got a Pulitzer Prize himself. Fascinating character, I think, who's way ahead of his time, and his stuff is still worth reading, especially if you're Welsh. Thank you for listening.
Anybody got any questions for Geoff before we pack up and go?
Was his body brought?
Sorry?
Was his body brought back?
Yes.
Is there a grave found?
The grave is in Barry.
Barry.
The photograph, yes. It's in a cemetery just outside Barry. And there's a plaque to him inside the church. The British Embassy organised that. And Mr. Purpose, I think, wrote to Gareth's parents and saying, he lent me this book and I thought you'd like to have it back. He was such a nice man, or some such thing. The guy who had a hand in the killing.
Sorry, could I just ask Geoff, what was the constitutional position of Ukraine at this time, Geoff?
It
With all
was
the horror that was going. We know the horrors that we have today, but it appears that it was very much sort of this sort of pressure being put on, if you like, by the central government in Russia.
Yes, it was effectively part of the Soviet Union. It wasn't independent. And that's part of...
As part of the Soviet Union, it appears that a huge pressure has been put on them for some reason.
Well, Ukraine was called the breadbasket of Europe. It had the best land called the Black Earth. It really was the breadbasket of Europe. And today they're trying to export grain from Ukraine, and that was feeding the Soviet Union. And what Stalin was doing two things. He was taking the grain from the Soviet Union, diverting it as little as he could to Russians, generally people living in the cities, because that's where the risk wasn't in the countryside, and selling the rest in order to industrialize Russia. So Ukraine was central to his strategy, and collectivization was the way he thought he was going to achieve this, which in its own way killed no end of people as well. But it's a part of Russia at this point.
And yet there was great starvation in Ukraine as well. So,
yes, well, it was the classic... the way the how can I describe it? You've heard of the 5-year plan and the 10-year plan. They set these plans, this, whatever enterprise it was, whether it was making steel or growing something, the plan was that for example, you have to grow 1 million tons. Now, you're not going to grow 1 million tons because you haven't got the right feed and you haven't got the right circumstances. But so say you make 800,000, but you tell them you've made 1 million, because otherwise you're going to get a beating. And the guys reporting up to Moscow who've got a target of 1 million say, well, actually, we did well, collectivization, 1.2 million. So the whole thing, there was an edifice of lies that the guys at the top thought, may even have thought that things were brilliant, but they weren't, that people were starving all over the place. There's no question that the Soviet government knew about starvation. They knew people were dying. They knew they were dying in the streets and all the rest of it. But Ukraine at the time was part of the Soviet Union, yeah.
Didn't they stop the Ukrainians leaving the country? They closed the border
They did close the borders, yes, both ways.
to Russia for jobs or anything like that?
And the situation in Ukraine was complicated a little by the fact that John Hughes, who built the iron and steel industry in eastern Ukraine, found that Ukrainians weren't good industrial workers. So he imported a lot of Russian people to work in these enterprises, which made that part of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, the part that's now separated and occupied by Russia, is largely Russian speaking. And that was a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
Nothing changes, really, does it?
No.
Wasn't there a time when a lot of Ukraine was occupied by the Cossacks and the Tartars, and they were moved by Stalin out of Ukraine into the Bundu, into Siberia?
Oh, I wouldn't be at all surprised. I haven't researched that, but he was, what did they call it? Russification was one part of the strategy. But the thing was, even though Stalin was Georgian, he had a huge distrust of what he called the nationalities. And there was a member of the Politburo who was called the Minister for Nationalities. And his job was to minimize the independence and power of these national groups. And one way of doing that is to import Russians. And the other thing to do is export these people off to Siberia and wherever. So the clear policy on the part of the Soviet government to do that.
I know you don't like the film, Geoff, but parts of it were quite accurate, weren't they? When he got off the train
Yes.
Before the station and saw the terrible famine.
Yes.
So do you think people who haven't seen the film, do you think it would spoil what
No, I don't. I think you just have to take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt. I think the facts, what they've taken is the basic facts and they've dressed it up a bit. But Durante appears in the film quite quite the way he was. Yeah. Oh, it's worth a watch. But the Storyville, the BBC4 programme is the one to watch if you want it that way.
It's on Storyville, is it?
It's available on YouTube. Yeah. Bit of technology, that.
Yeah.
There's a saying, there was a great tyrant called Lenin who did 1 or 2 million men in. But where he did one in, well, that was a lot to have done in, but where he did one in, that great tyrant Stalin did 10 in.
I've never heard that, but that sounds about right to me. Yeah.
It's a bit complicated.
Yeah. Oh, I think life is still cheap in the Soviet Union and in Russia.
It was another Stalin.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.